The everlasting covenant. This is the theme of the whole Bible, but it's also interesting that it's mentioned most in the book of Deuteronomy, and this is why this entire book is also called the book of the covenant. A couple months ago, we spent an entire quarter talking about the subject of the covenant or agreement because it's a big one. So, where should we start?
The covenant existed long before Israel and even before Abraham too, because it is simply an expression of God's attitude and of the mutual relationship between God and people. Everything that a covenant says is, I promise you this, I promise you that. Like with Abraham, for example, there was a promise for him to become a great nation, like the number of the stars. That will be a blessing for all the nations around him. And there was a second promise. There was a promise to Abraham to take over the land, occupy the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, and etc. Two big promises. Abraham's response was that he believed it and lived it like as it is, as it will happen. None of the promises were on merits, though, but it was God's intent, out of grace only, to bless this man. Abraham, of course, embraced it and answered with faith. He believed it, that it will become true. And this is what the gospel was and is today in its core essence. God gives and man receives. The exchange is framed in a covenant or a contract that outlines the promises and the responses.
In other words, after humanity broke with God and decided to take part of the challenge against Him, with time, the knowledge about God and our purpose and origin got lost. But God reached out and said, if you trust me, if you follow me, if you listen to me, I will get you out of this misery and I will restore you for what I created you for. Getting this message across, though, proved to be very difficult and a lengthy process. God made such covenants with Noah and others, but it started in a more special way with Abraham and then continued with Israel, saving them from Egypt, from slavery, as He is saving us today from the slavery of sin. And this takes us to the book of Deuteronomy, which is also called the book of the covenant, where God forms a very special bond with Israel.
Yeah, the book of Deuteronomy represents a continuation of the previous covenant with their fathers and merging it right now with the very personal encounter and personal covenant of Israel with God on the Mount Sinai and in Moab just before the entry in Canaan. So they inherited the promises from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. However, they also shook hands personally with God because He delivered them from Egypt. Covenant based on grace of God only. Again, no merits.
So God and Israel entered into an agreement first, but then Israel failed miserably from the get-go. Now, 40 years later, with a new generation ready to enter into the promise, the covenant is re-established. It is important to try to imagine the situation of the world at the time, drowning in paganism with horrifying practices and values. God needed people that will experience and that will reflect and testify about the saving grace and the incredible transformation that God can do in us.
A few times already I've stressed on what was God's part in the covenant, giving as an act of grace and making promises. How about the people? What was their part of the covenant? It was the commitment to be the nation that God wanted them to be. And Moses appealed to them to commit now. Why? Why now? They were just about to enter in Canaan. But wasn't that their natural reaction as a response? Yes, but not for long though. Commitment creates a purpose. Commitment creates a mission. It is a conscious decision for a direction where to go and stick with it for the long term. It was the response out of faith that Abraham chose and was granted righteousness. So what we see is the same covenant, the same gospel, the same commitment. And that's why it's an everlasting covenant.
Well, it's a big topic. How does this covenant work? What can we do? What is being done for us? What are the bases of the relationship with God? The next lessons look into some of those questions. So join us next week for the study To Love the Lord Your God.